Take it all off, right now, Edgar Thorne growled, his yellow teeth gleaming beneath a jagged scar that ran from his left eye to the corner of his mouth. A permanent reminder of the knife fight that had earned him the nickname Devil's Face throughout Colorado territory. The cabin smelled of whiskey, sweat, and fear. Margaret trembled, her bare feet pressing into the rough wooden floor. The lantern light caught the glint in Thorne's eyes, the same predatory look she'd seen when he'd beaten a man half to death in Silverton just for spilling his drink. No, she whispered, the word hanging in the air between them like gun smoke. Have you ever had to make a split-second decision that would change your entire life? Would you find the courage to stand against a man known for his brutality when everything is at stake? Edgar's face contorted with rage. He slammed his fist on the table, sending his whiskey bottle shattering against the wall. I paid good money for you, girl. Your stepfather's debt won't be settled till I get what I want. Margaret wrapped her arms around herself, clutching the torn sleeve of her dress. Outside, the Colorado night was black as coal. The year 1876, a time when the silver boom was making men rich and desperate in equal measure, offered no mercy to a young woman sold to settle a gambling debt. Edgar rose from his chair, his bulk casting a massive shadow across the cabin wall. You think you have a choice? He laughed, a sound like gravel in a tin can. Frank Sullivan sold you fair and square. You're mine now. Margaret backed away until her spine pressed against the rough-hewn logs of the cabin wall. Her eyes darted frantically, searching for anything that might help her. In the corner, half hidden beneath a ragged blanket, lay a splintered board that had come loose from the wall. Edgar lurched forward and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. With his other hand, he struck her hard across the face. The force of the blow sent her stumbling sideways. The room spun as the coppery taste of blood filled her mouth. I said strip, he snarled, grabbing her dress and tearing it at the shoulder. The sound of ripping fabric filled the cabin. Something inside Margaret snapped. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. There comes a time when you must decide who you're going to be in this world. In one desperate lunge, Margaret dove for the wooden board. Her fingers closed around the rough wood. Feeling the splinters dig into her palm, she whirled around just as Edgar reached for her again. The board connected with his temple with a sickening crack. Edgar's eyes went wide with shock. He staggered backward, blood trickling down the side of his face, before crumpling to the floor like a felled oak. For a moment, the cabin was silent, except for Margaret's ragged breathing. Edgar lay motionless, his chest still rising and falling. She had only seconds to decide. Run. Clutching the board to her chest to cover herself, Margaret burst through the cabin door and fled into the night. The darkness swallowed her as she ran barefoot across the rocky ground, each step sending shards of pain up her legs. But fear drove her forward, away from the cabin, away from the man who had bought her like cattle. Jackson Caldwell stood on the porch of his Lone Creek ranch, Winchester Model 1873 rifle resting comfortably in the crook of his arm. The .44-40 caliber was a perfect balance of stopping power and accuracy. The gun that won the West, as many called it. At 42, the lines on his weathered face told stories of hardship and survival. The gray at his temples had appeared after Gettysburg, where he'd served as a captain in the 7th Cavalry Regiment of the Union Army. Those who knew him well understood that behind his quiet demeanor lay a man who could outshoot nearly anyone in 3 counties. 5 years had passed since he'd buried his wife, Sarah, after the fever took her. Since then, he'd poured himself into building this ranch from nothing but dust and determination. Now with 50 head of cattle and 10 acres of workable land, Lone Creek was becoming something to be proud of. Jackson scanned the horizon, his eyes narrowing at the approach of dawn. Something had woken him early, a sound perhaps, or just that sixth sense a man develops after years of living on the frontier. His hand moved to the Colt single-action army, holstered at his hip, checking that the hammer rested on an empty chamber, the way he always carried it. 5 live rounds ready to fire with the hammer pulled back. Plenty for most troubles. As the first rays of sunlight crept over the eastern ridge, Jackson spotted movement at the edge of his property. Raising his Winchester, he peered through the early morning mist. It wasn't a coyote or a wolf. It was a person, stumbling, falling, then rising again. Jackson moved down the steps, keeping to the shadows of the barn. The figure collapsed beneath the old cottonwood tree near his fence line. As he approached, rifle at the ready, the details became clear. A woman, young, barely clothed, clutching what looked like a piece of wood to her chest. Her feet were bloodied, her face bruised, and her eyes wild with fear when they found his. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry kindling. "Don't send me back." Jackson froze, taking in the sight before him. In his 15 years on the frontier, he'd seen his share of misery, but the desperation in this woman's eyes cut through him like a knife. For a brief moment, doubt flickered across his face. Taking her in meant trouble, the kind of trouble that followed a man to his grave. Without a word, he removed his duster and gently draped it around her shoulders. She flinched at his movement, but then clutched at the coat, pulling it tight around her body. The wooden board she'd been holding fell to the ground with a hollow sound. "I'm not going to hurt you," Jackson said, his voice low and steady. "Can you walk?" She nodded weakly. Jackson helped her to her feet, but her legs buckled beneath her. Without hesitation, he lifted her into his arms, noticing how light she was, as if the world had already taken more than its fair share from her. Inside his cabin, Jackson set her down carefully in a chair by the fire. He moved to an old trunk in the corner, opened it, and pulled out a faded blue dress. "It was my wife's," he said simply, placing it beside the young woman. "I'll step outside while you change." When he returned, she had donned the dress. It hung loose on her frame, but covered her dignity. Her hands still trembled as she clutched a cup of hot coffee he had given her. "I'm Jackson Caldwell," he said, sitting across from her. "This is Lone Creek Ranch." "Margaret," she replied, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Margaret Taylor." Slowly in halting words, her story emerged. Her mother had died when she was 12. Her stepfather, Frank Sullivan, had gambled away everything they owned. When there was nothing left to bet, he had used her to settle a debt with Edgar Thorne, a man known for gun running and worse. "He sold me," Margaret said, her voice hollow, "like I was cattle." Jackson's jaw tightened, but he kept his face neutral. "And the man you were sold to?" "Edgar Thorne. I hit him with a board when he—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "I don't know if he's dead or alive. I just ran." Jackson nodded. He knew of Edgar Thorne, a man who'd made his fortune selling weapons during the war, and had since moved on to less legal ventures. He wasn't someone to cross lightly. "You're safe here for now," Jackson said, standing up and looking out the window. "But they'll come looking." Margaret looked up, fear flashing in her eyes. "What will you do when they come?" Jackson checked his Colt, spinning the cylinder before returning it to his holster. "What needs doing? It's a man's duty to stand against evil, even when the odds aren't in his favor. Have you ever wondered what makes a person risk everything for a stranger? Is it merely honor, or something deeper that defines who we truly are?" The sound of hoofbeats came 3 days later, just as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the mountains. Jackson had been expecting it. He'd spent the time teaching Margaret how to handle his spare Winchester, a Model 1873 with a 20-inch barrel that was lighter than his own. "Remember me," he told her. "Lever down, lever up, aim, breathe out, squeeze gently. Don't jerk the trigger. Let the shot surprise you." Now he motioned for her to go inside as he stepped onto the porch, his hand resting casually near his Colt. A single rider approached, dust billowing behind him. Even from a distance, Jackson recognized Frank Sullivan, a man he'd seen in town, usually drunk and looking for easy money at the poker tables. Sullivan reined in his horse about 20 yards from the house, his bloodshot eyes scanning the property. "Caldwell," he called out, his voice carrying the slur of a man who'd had whiskey for breakfast. "I believe you got something that belongs to me." Jackson didn't move. "Nothing here belongs to you, Sullivan." Frank spat on the ground. "My stepdaughter, the girl. She ran off 3 nights ago from a business arrangement." He attempted a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Being family, I got a right to take her back." "She's not property to be traded, Sullivan," Jackson replied, his voice level, but edged with steel. "And this is my land." Frank's hand twitched near his holster, a cheap thing with a frayed leather strap. "Thorne paid good money for her. He wants what he paid for, or I'll be the one paying with my hide." Jackson's voice dropped lower. "You've said your piece. Now ride out." For a moment, Sullivan's face twisted with indecision. Then, with the recklessness of a desperate man, his hand went for his gun. Jackson's draw was lightning fast, the result of years of practice and hard-learned necessity. His Colt cleared leather and fired in one smooth motion. The bullet kicked up dirt inches from Sullivan's boot, causing his horse to rear. Sullivan's own gun had barely cleared its holster. His face went pale as he struggled to control his frightened mount. "Next time, I won't be aiming at the ground, Frank," Jackson said calmly, his gun still trained on the man. "I'll put a bullet right through your chest. Now ride out and don't come back." Frank Sullivan turned his horse and galloped away, a stream of curses trailing behind him. Jackson watched until he disappeared over the ridge before holstering his weapon. Inside, Margaret stood by the window, the Winchester clutched in her hands. "He'll be back," she said, "and he won't come alone." Jackson nodded. "I know. That's why we need to be ready." Later that evening, as Margaret cleaned the dishes from their simple dinner, Jackson noticed a rider watching the ranch from the distant ridge, just for a moment before disappearing into the tree line. The silent warning sent a chill through him. They were being watched. "Get down!" Jackson suddenly ordered, pulling Margaret away from the window as a single rifle shot cracked through the evening air. The bullet splintered the window frame, showering them with wood chips. "Just a warning," Jackson said grimly. "They're letting us know they're coming." Over the next 2 days, Jackson fortified the ranch as best he could. He moved the horses to the smaller corral behind the barn, stockpiled ammunition, and created firing positions in the house and barn. Each night, he took watch while Margaret slept, catching what rest he could during daylight hours. In town, Jackson visited his old friend Bill Cooper at the general store. Bill had served in the same regiment during the war and now ran the most prosperous business in the small settlement of Pine Creek. "Heard you've got a visitor," Bill said as Jackson collected supplies, "and that she's causing quite a stir." "Word travels fast," Jackson replied, counting out shells for his Winchester. Bill leaned across the counter. "Word is Edgar Thorne's offering $50 to anyone who brings her back, and he's mighty upset about that gash on his head. So he's alive, unfortunately, and from what I hear, he's bringing in some hired guns. 3 of them rode in last night, mean-looking bastards with Remingtons and bad attitudes." Jackson added coffee and sugar to his supplies. "Anything else I should know?" Bill's voice dropped lower. "Sullivan's with them. Looks like he's trying to save his own skin by helping Thorne." He hesitated before adding, "You sure about this, Jack? These aren't just drunks looking for a fight. Thorne's got connections all the way to Denver. My pa taught me that a man who won't stand for something will fall for anything," Jackson said, his voice quiet but firm. "I've seen too many good people crushed by men like Thorne. Sometimes the Lord puts you in a position where you have to choose, and I've made my choice." As he rode back to the ranch, Jackson considered his options. 5 against 2 weren't favorable odds, especially since Margaret had never fired a gun in anger. But he'd faced worse in the war, and he had the advantage of defending his own property. Back at the ranch, he found Margaret sitting on the porch steps, the Winchester across her knees. Her face was different now, less frightened, more determined. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a yellowish shadow. "They're coming, aren't they?" she asked as he dismounted. "Yes," Jackson replied simply. "Tomorrow or the next day, most likely." Margaret nodded, her hand tightening on the rifle. "Will you teach me more? I don't want to hide while you fight for me." Jackson studied her face. In just a few days, he'd seen her transform from a terrified girl into a woman with steel in her spine. Something about her reminded him of Sarah, not in looks, but in that quiet determination that some women found in themselves when pushed to the edge. "All right," he said, "let's see what you remember about that Winchester. What would you risk to protect someone who couldn't protect themselves? Would you stand your ground when facing overwhelming odds?" They came at dusk the next day, just as the shadows were growing long across the yard. Jackson spotted the dust cloud from the lookout he'd established in the hayloft of the barn. 5 riders spread out in a line as they approached, a tactic designed to make it difficult to target them all at once. Jackson recognized Edgar Thorne at the center, a bandage still visible on his temple. Frank Sullivan rode to his right, looking nervous. The other 3 were strangers, hard men with the practiced look of guns for hire. "Remember the plan," Jackson called softly to Margaret, who was positioned upstairs with the Winchester. "Wait until they're in the yard before you start firing. Aim for the horses if you can't hit the riders." He moved silently to his position behind the water trough, his own rifle ready. His Colt was freshly oiled and loaded, sitting comfortably in its holster. The riders stopped about 50 yards out. Edgar Thorne's voice carried across the open space. "Caldwell, send out the girl and we'll leave your ranch standing. Keep her, and we'll burn everything to the ground after we're done with you." Jackson remained silent, watching through a gap in the wooden slats. The men exchanged glances, then began to advance slowly into the yard. "Last chance, Caldwell," Thorne shouted. When they were 30 yards in, Jackson squeezed the trigger. His first shot struck one of the hired guns in the shoulder, sending him tumbling from his horse. The yard erupted in chaos as the men scattered, drawing weapons and firing wildly at the barn and house. From the upstairs window, Margaret's Winchester cracked 3 times. She didn't hit anyone, but one of the horses reared and bolted, leaving its rider diving for cover behind the water trough, right where Jackson wanted him. Jackson swung around and fired point blank, catching the man in the chest before he could level his Remington. The man's eyes widened in surprise before he slumped to the ground. Gunfire peppered the barn where Jackson was hidden. Wood splintered around him as bullets found their mark in the aging structure. He rolled to a new position, catching a glimpse of Sullivan making a run for the house, where Margaret was. "Margaret, the side door!" Jackson shouted. He brought his rifle to bear on another of the hired guns who was trying to flank him. The man ducked behind a barrel but left his leg exposed. Jackson's shot caught him in the calf, sending him sprawling with a howl of pain. Edgar Thorne was still on his horse, firing a pistol in each hand as he charged toward the barn. Jackson levered a fresh round into his Winchester and took careful aim. The shot caught Thorne's horse in the chest. The animal went down hard, sending Thorne tumbling into the dirt. Jackson used the moment to sprint from the barn toward the house, keeping low. Gunfire followed him, kicking up dust at his heels. He made it to the porch just as he heard Margaret scream from inside. Crashing through the door, Jackson found Frank Sullivan struggling with Margaret at the foot of the stairs. The Winchester lay on the floor where it had been knocked from her hands. Sullivan had his hands around her throat, his face twisted with rage. Jackson lunged forward and yanked Sullivan off her, throwing him against the wall. Sullivan recovered quickly, drawing a knife from his boot and slashing wildly. The blade caught Jackson across the forearm, opening a long gash that immediately began to bleed. Sullivan grinned, seeing his advantage. "Should have minded your own business, Caldwell." He charged again, knife held low. Jackson sidestepped, but his injured arm was slow. Sullivan's neck slash caught him across the ribs, tearing through his shirt and drawing blood. Jackson staggered back, reaching for his Colt. Before he could draw, Sullivan was on him again, driving him back against the table. The knife rose, poised for a killing blow, aimed straight at Jackson's throat. Crack! Sullivan's eyes went blank as he crumpled to the floor. Behind him stood Margaret, holding the same wooden board she'd escaped with, now stained with blood at one end. "That's twice this board has saved my life," she said, her voice shaking. Before Jackson could respond, the front door burst open. Edgar Thorne stood in the doorway, blood streaming down his face from a cut on his forehead, both pistols aimed into the room. "You cost me a fine horse, Caldwell," he growled, his yellow teeth bared in a grimace of pain and fury. "Now I'm going to—" Jackson's Colt roared twice in rapid succession. Both bullets found their mark, center mass. Thorne's pistols fired reflexively as he fell, the bullets burying themselves harmlessly in the ceiling. For a moment, silence filled the house. Outside, the last hired gun could be heard galloping away, apparently deciding that whatever Thorne was paying wasn't worth his life. Jackson holstered his weapon and looked at Margaret. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, still clutching the wooden board. "You are, though." He glanced down at his bleeding arm. Had worse. Together they stepped onto the porch, surveying the aftermath. 2 bodies lay in the yard, another by the water trough. Frank Sullivan was unconscious inside, and Edgar Thorne would never rise again. "It's over," Jackson said quietly. Sheriff Tom Miller arrived the next morning with 2 deputies, alerted by Bill Cooper, as Jackson had asked. The lawman surveyed the scene with a practiced eye, noting the bodies and the damage to the ranch. "Self-defense," he concluded after hearing both Jackson's and Margaret's accounts. "Thorne was wanted for gun running anyway. You did the county a service, Jack." Sullivan was taken into custody, facing charges of assault and human trafficking, a new law that was being enforced with increasing regularity as civilization spread westward. News of the gunfight at Lone Creek Ranch spread quickly. Some said Jackson Caldwell had faced down 7 men, not 5. Others claimed Edgar Thorne had been one of the most dangerous criminals in the Colorado Territory. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. For Margaret, the following weeks brought a transformation. The bruises healed, and with them, something of her spirit mended as well. She learned to ride, to shoot with greater accuracy, and to help with the daily work of the ranch. The faded blue dress was joined by practical work clothes, and the fear in her eyes was replaced by a quiet confidence. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson, Margaret spoke of the future for the first time. "I'd like to stay," she said simply, "if you'll have me as a hand on the ranch." Jackson nodded, his eyes on the horizon. Ranch could use another good hand. What remained unspoken between them was how the dynamics had shifted. Margaret was no longer just a woman he had rescued. She had saved his life in return. In the code of the West, that created a bond not easily broken. "This land has seen blood and tears," Jackson said, gesturing to the expanse of Lone Creek before them. "But now it's ours, and no one can take it from us again." Margaret's hand found the wooden board, which now hung beside the door as a reminder of where she had come from and what she had survived. "No," she agreed, "they can't." 3 months later, a rider came to Lone Creek Ranch with news that sent a chill through both Jackson and Margaret. Vince Thorne, Edgar's brother, had arrived in Denver, asking questions about his brother's death. Unlike Edgar, Vince was known to be calculating and patient, a man who served revenge cold. "Sometimes standing for what's right isn't a single battle," Jackson said that night as they prepared the ranch for a new threat. "It's a life's commitment." Margaret nodded, her fingers tracing the scarred surface of the wooden board that now held a place of honor above the fireplace. Then we stand together. Jackson looked at her, seeing not the frightened girl who had stumbled onto his property, but a partner forged in fire. Together, he agreed. In time, respect grew into something deeper, not a whirlwind romance from dime novels, but something stronger, a partnership forged in fire and built on mutual respect. Jackson never pushed and Margaret never rushed, but the comfort they found in each other's company slowly knit them together. The folks in town stopped referring to her as that poor girl from the Caldwell place and began to nod respectfully when Margaret rode in for supplies. The women who had initially whispered behind their hands when she passed now invited her to socials and church functions. "You know what separates men from beasts, Margaret?" Jackson said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. "It's not our strength or our guns. It's knowing when to use them, and more importantly, when to stand your ground for what's right, even if you stand alone." So I ask you, what made a real man in those wild days? Was it the gun in his hand or the principles in his heart? Have you ever had to stand up for someone when everyone else looked away? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the story, be sure to tune in next week when I tell you about the man with the silver gun, the tale of a former sheriff who faced down Vince Thorne and his notorious border gang as they sought revenge for Edgar's death. Until then, this is the Wild West Channel, bringing history to life, one story at a time.